There are fates worse than death in the grim darkness of the far future. For a space marine, death in battle is an honor. For a Chaos Space Marine of the Emperor's children, death might be a release from the endless pursuit of sensation. But for an Emperor's children, warrior entombed within a Dreadnought chassis, captured alive by Orks, death becomes a distant dream, and the nightmare that unfolds is beyond what even the servants of Slaanesh could imagine. This is a story about the collision of two fundamentally incompatible philosophies of warfare. On one side, we have the Emperor's children, devotees of Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of excess and sensation, warriors who have spent millennia chasing every possible experience, every whisper of pleasure and pain, pushing the boundaries of what the mortal form can endure in their quest for the ultimate sensation. On the other side, we have the Orks, the galaxy's most prolific scavengers, beings who see a fallen enemy war machine not as a tomb containing a tortured soul, but as a brilliant opportunity for a spot of looting and some proper Orky modifications. To understand the true horror of what happens when these two forces intersect, we must first comprehend what makes an Emperor's Children Dreadnought such a unique and terrible thing, and why falling into Ork hands transforms an already nightmarish existence into something that defies comprehension. The Nightmare of Slaaneshi. Entombment. For most Space Marine chapters, entombment within a Dreadnought chassis is considered the highest honor. A warrior too grievously wounded to continue fighting in the flesh is given the chance to serve the Emperor beyond death, their consciousness preserved within an armored sarcophagus, awakened only when the chapter has dire need of their wisdom and prowess. These ancients are revered, their counsel sought, their sacrifice honored across the millennia. But the Emperor's children are not most Space Marines. They are the fallen sons of Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the Primarch who led his legion into damnation during the Horus heresy. Before their fall, the Third Legion was obsessed with perfection, with achieving the apex of martial excellence in every endeavor. After their corruption by Slaanesh, that obsession twisted into something far darker. The pursuit of perfection became the pursuit of excess, of sensation, of experiences so intense that they burned away everything that made them human and left only the raw, screaming need for more. For an Emperor's Children warrior, existence is defined by sensation. Every moment must be filled with input, with stimulation, with experiences that push the boundaries of what the mind and body can process. They augment themselves with Xenos drugs and demonic pacts. They modify their armor to amplify every sensory input. They seek out the most extreme experiences in combat, because only in the absolute peak of intensity can they still feel anything at all. The curse of Slaanesh is that each new high demands an ever greater stimulus to achieve the same result. What once brought ecstasy now barely registers. The threshold keeps rising, the need keeps growing, and the quest becomes all-consuming. Now, imagine taking such a warrior and placing them in a Dreadnought. The standard Dreadnought chassis is designed to preserve life and enable continued service, but it is not designed for sensory experience. The pilot's broken body is suspended in an amniotic tank, their nervous system hardwired into the machine systems through mind impulse units and cognitive interface arrays. They can see through optical sensors. They can hear through audio pickups. They can maneuver the chassis and fire its weapons. But the richness of human sensory experience is gone. The feeling of wind on skin, the taste of victory, the smell of fear, the texture of enemy flesh beneath a blade, all of these are filtered through mechanical proxies or lost entirely. For a loyalist Space Marine, this is a tolerable sacrifice. For a warrior of the Emperor's Children, it is worse than death. The Emperor's Children developed a specific variant of Chaos Dreadnought called the Sonic Dreadnought to address this problem. These war machines mount massive sonic weaponry, scaled-up versions of the Noise Marine's trademark instruments of destruction. The Blastmaster, the Sonic Blaster, the Doom Siren, all of these produce sound waves of such intensity that they can liquefy flesh, shatter bone, and reduce fortifications to rubble. But more than that, they create sensation. The pilot of a sonic dreadnought experiences the harmonics of destruction, feels the resonance of their weapons through every sensor, and finds in the screams of dying enemies a pale echo of the sensations they have lost. It is not enough. It is never enough. But it is something. Even with these modifications, entombment is viewed by the Emperor's children not as an honor, but as a punishment. It is a sentence handed down to those who have failed their warband, who have displeased their lord, or who simply had the misfortune to suffer catastrophic injuries at an inconvenient time. Some pilots volunteer, driven by the hope that this new form of existence will offer sensations they have never experienced before. They are invariably disappointed. The initial novelty of piloting a walking war machine fades quickly, and what remains is a sensory deprivation more profound than anything their pre-fallen selves could have imagined. The pilot's organic remains float in a suspension of alchemical fluids, connected to the dreadnought systems through dozens of cables and neural interfaces. They retain consciousness, but that consciousness is a prison. The amniotic fluid that sustains them deadens sensation. The metal shell that protects them cuts them off from the world they once knew. The sonic weaponry provides stimulus, yes, but it is a single note in what was once a symphony of experience. They are locked in darkness, trapped in their own minds, able to observe the world, but not truly participate in it. For the servants of Slaanesh, who have spent centuries or even millennia in pursuit of ever greater sensations, this sensory isolation is torture of the most exquisite kind. It is the one thing they cannot abide, the one fate they fear above all others. And yet, when the alternative is true death, and the possibility that Slaanesh might claim their soul for an eternity of service in the warp, even this half-life becomes preferable. The sonic dreadnought pilots of the Emperor's children exist in a state of perpetual hunger. They hunger for sensation, for stimulation, for anything that will make them feel even a fraction of what they once felt. They throw themselves into battle with a desperation that borders on madness, because combat is the only time when their weapons sing and the vibrations of destruction ripple through their senses, and for a few precious moments, they can almost feel something real. This is the baseline. This is the nightmare that the Emperor's children dreadnought pilot endures every moment of every day. Being entombed in a sonic dreadnought is already a fate that would break most beings. It is a hell custom designed for those who worship at the altar of excess, a punishment that takes everything they value and locks it away behind layers of ceramite and adamantium. Now imagine that hell getting infinitely worse. The Ork philosophy of warfare and acquisition. To understand what happens when Orks capture one of these walking nightmares, we must understand what Orks are and how they view the galaxy around them. Orks are, without question, one of the most successful species in the galaxy. They outnumber humanity. They have spread to every corner of the Milky Way. They thrive in conditions that would kill most other forms of life. And they do all of this with technology that appears to be barely functional, weapons that look like they were assembled by demented children, and vehicles that by all rights should explode the moment someone tries to start them. The secret to Ork success is not sophisticated engineering or advanced technology. It is belief. Orks possess a latent psychic field that they call the WH40K, a gestalt consciousness that grows stronger as more Orks gather together. This field has the remarkable property of making things work simply because Orks believe they should work. Red vehicles go faster because Orks believe red is the color of speed. Guns fire because Orks believe pulling the trigger makes them fire, even if the weapon in question has no firing pin, no ammunition, or no actual barrel. The WH40K field fills in the gaps, makes the impossible possible, and allows orcs to wage war with equipment that would be useless in anyone else's hands. This gives orcs an enormous advantage when it comes to looting. They do not need to understand how a piece of technology actually works. They do not need to maintain it according to the original specifications. They do not need compatible parts or proper tools or any of the things that other races require. They simply need to believe that their modifications will work, and the WH40K field makes it so. Looting is more than just a practical necessity for orcs. It is a fundamental part of their culture. Every orc knows that the best weapons are the ones you take from defeated enemies. A chopper made from scrap is fine, but a chopper made from a Space Marine's power sword is better. A shooter cobbled together from spare parts is adequate, but a shooter made from an Imperial Guard lasgun is superior, not because it is actually better engineered, but because it is loot, and loot has inherent value in orc society. The process of looting follows a fairly predictable pattern. After a battle, swarms of Gretchen, the smaller, weaker cousins of the orcs, scurry across the battlefield, collecting anything that looks useful or valuable. They bring their haul back to the mech boys, the orc mechanics who possess an instinctive understanding of technology. The mech boys examine the loot, decide what can be repurposed, and begin the process of making it properly orky. This process typically involves several key steps. First, strip away anything that is not obviously functional. Pretty decorations, complex control systems, safety features, all of these are superfluous. Second, add more weapons. If it can mount a gun, it should mount several guns. If it cannot mount a gun, modify it until it can. Third, make it louder. Orcs love noise. The roar of engines, the thunder of guns, the screaming of victims, all of these are music to greenskin ears. Fourth, paint it properly, usually red, because red goes faster, but color choice depends on clan affiliation and personal preference. Finally, add decorative elements that make it clear this is now orc property. Teeth, bones, spikes, chains, crude glyphs, and battle trophies all serve this purpose. The whole process is guided by what orcs call orky know-whats, an instinctive understanding that allows mech boys to look at a piece of machinery and immediately grasp its essential function, even if they cannot explain how or why it works. This is another gift of their genetic heritage, another tool given to them by the ancient beings who created them. Combined with the reality-warping power of the WH40K field, it makes orcs perhaps the most prolific salvagers in the galaxy. Orc warbands have been known to loot virtually everything. Imperial Guard Lehman Russ tanks become looted wagons, bristling with additional weapons and painted in garish colors. Space Marine rhinos are stripped down and rebuilt as crude troop transports. Even Titans, the massive god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, have been captured and repurposed by particularly ambitious mech boys. There is a legend among the greenskins of a looter called Grabber Gutzbag, who was supposedly able to loot anything, including several Titans over the course of his illustrious career. But orcs do not just loot vehicles. They loot weapons, armor, equipment, and even people. Captured enemies are sometimes forced to work as slaves, building defenses or operating machinery that the orcs cannot be bothered to deal with themselves. More often, they become test subjects for pain boys, the orc medical specialists who are the biological equivalent of mech boys. Pain boys are perhaps the most feared of all orc odd boys. While mech boys are respected for their ability to keep the war machines running, pain boys inspire genuine dread even in other orcs. This is because pain boys possess an instinctive understanding of anatomy and surgery, but they lack any concept of medical ethics, patient care, or unnecessary procedures. When a pain boy operates on an injured orc, he is just as likely to remove random organs to see how they work, as he is to actually treat the injury. The replacement of damaged limbs with crude bionics is a common practice. but the pain boy might get distracted and attach the new arm where the leg used to be, or decide that the patient would benefit from an extra head, or conduct a squig brain transplant just to see what happens. For non-orc captives, being handed over to a pain boy is a death sentence, but usually not a quick one. Pain boys are endlessly curious about alien anatomy. They will conduct vivisections without anesthetic, testing the limits of their subject's endurance. They will replace limbs with mechanical parts just to see if it is possible. They will inject experimental serums, transplant organs, and generally treat the living body as a canvas for their crude medical experiments. The fact that their subjects rarely survive these procedures does not bother pain boys in the slightest. After all, there are always more captives, and the knowledge gained from each experiment is valuable, at least until the pain boy forgets it and has to start over with the next subject. This, then, is the world that an Emperor's Children Dreadnought enters when it falls into orc hands. It is a world where nothing is sacred, where function matters more than form, where the very concept of proper maintenance or respectful treatment of ancient war machines is completely alien. To the orcs, the Dreadnought is not a tomb containing a once mighty warrior. It is not a relic to be honored or a prisoner to be interrogated. It is loot, pure and simple. It is a big stompy thing with guns, and that makes it automatically interesting. The fact that there is someone alive inside just makes it more interesting, because that means there is something to experiment on. The capture. The circumstances that lead to an Emperor's Children's Sonic Dreadnought falling into orc hands can vary considerably, but they all share certain common elements that make such a capture possible in the first place. The battle must be catastrophic enough that the warband cannot retrieve their war machines, either because the fighting is too intense to allow for recovery operations, or because the surviving Chaos Space Marines are forced into a retreat that leaves their heavier equipment behind. The Dreadnought itself must be disabled but not destroyed, which is a fairly narrow window of damage. Too little, and the Dreadnought can still fight, or at least self-destruct. Too much, and there is nothing left worth looting. And finally, the Orks must both win the engagement decisively enough to secure the battlefield and be interested enough in the prize to drag it back to their camp rather than simply blowing it up for fun, which is always the simpler option when Orks are involved. These conditions are rare but not impossible. Orks fight constantly, everywhere, against everyone, and the sheer volume of conflict they participate in means that eventually they will encounter every possible situation. And Emperor's Children warbands, for all their martial prowess and their enhanced abilities, are not immune to defeat. Their obsession with sensation sometimes leads them to take unnecessary risks, to prolong battles for the sake of experiencing more intense combat, to focus on personal glory rather than tactical objectives. These tendencies can and do result in catastrophic defeats when they face opponents who do not play by the expected rules. Let us imagine a specific scenario, one that plays out across countless worlds in the galaxy's endless wars, with variations in the details but the same essential trajectory. A trajectory that begins with confident assault and ends with capture, violation, and transformation. The warband is called the Flawless Torment, a splinter faction of the Emperor's Children that has spent the last 300 years raiding worlds along the eastern fringe. They have come to an imperial hive world, drawn by rumors of a decadent noble class, whose excesses might provide new sensations for jaded Chaos Space Marines. The raid begins well. The warband's noise Marines breach the hive's outer defenses with sonic weapons, the harmonics of their guns reducing blast doors to dust and defenders to pulp. Chaos Terminators advance through the streets, their combi bolters chattering as they gun down terrified civilians. The Sonic Dreadnought, piloted by a warrior who once bore the name Kalos, but who now answers only to the title, the Resonance, strides through the carnage like a god of sound and fury. Its blastmaster fires and hab blocks collapse. Its doom siren screams, and crowds of fleeing citizens are reduced to fine red mist. The pilot feels the vibrations through every sensor, drinks in the destruction like a man dying of thirst, and for a few precious moments, the hunger abates. But the raid has attracted attention from an unexpected quarter. An Ork, led by a particularly cunning warboss called Skullcrusher, has been rampaging through the same sector. The Orks detect the sounds of battle, the distinctive howl of sonic weapons, the screams of dying humans, and they alter course to join the fight. After all, where there is a scrap, there should be Orks. The two forces collide in the hive's central square, and the resulting battle is absolute chaos. Noise marines fill the air with deadly harmonics, but the Orks simply charge through the sonic barriers, their natural toughness and their sheer disregard for pain, allowing them to weather attacks that would liquefy normal troops. Chaos Space Marines fight with the perfection of centuries of experience, but they are vastly outnumbered by a green tide that crashes over their positions like a tsunami. The Resonance stands at the center of the maelstrom, its weapons firing in a constant barrage of destruction. Orks explode into fragments as the Blastmaster's focused harmonics tear through their bodies. Vehicles detonate as sonic pulses find their fuel tanks. For a time, it seems as though the Dreadnought alone might turn the tide of battle. Then everything goes wrong. An Ork looter with a looted Imperial Lascannon scores a lucky hit on the Dreadnought's power core. The shot does not penetrate, but it damages the plasma feeds and causes a cascade failure in the reactor's containment field. The Dreadnought's systems begin to shut down, emergency protocols activating to prevent a catastrophic detonation. The Resonance finds itself paralyzed, its weapons offline, its motor systems locked, its sensors dimming as auxiliary power struggles to keep the life support active. The pilot is trapped, fully conscious, fully aware, but unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything except watch through failing optical sensors as the battle rages around the immobile chassis. The pilot screams, but the Dreadnought's Vox speakers are offline. The pilot tries to will the machine to move, but the neural interfaces are severed. There is nothing but the horrible awareness of helplessness, the knowledge that something is terribly wrong, and the fading hope that the warband will retrieve the disabled machine before the enemy can capitalize on its vulnerability. That hope dies when warboss Skullcrusher himself arrives on the scene. The massive Ork, clad in mega armor and wielding a power claw that crackles with lethal energy, surveys the battlefield with the practiced eye of a veteran warrior. He sees the disabled Dreadnought, sees the other Chaos Space Marines falling back under the weight of superior numbers, and makes a tactical decision. The Emperor's children are broken. The raid is over. But that big purple stompy thing with the weird guns, that is worth having. Skullcrusher bellows orders to his boys. A mob of Orks surrounds the Dreadnought, their crude weapons ready in case it reactivates. Gretchins scurry forward with chains and cables, beginning the laborious process of securing the machine for transport. The warboss approaches the chassis himself, his massive form dwarfing even the Dreadnought, and he raps his power, claw against the ceramite armor with a resounding clang. "Dis is a proper bit of loot, dis is," he rumbles, his voice audible even through the Dreadnought's failing audio sensors. "Gonna make it right, Orky, we is. Give it more dakka, paint it red, maybe add a ram. Yeah, dis is gonna be right good when we is done with it." Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot experiences a new sensation. Not the thrill of battle or the ecstasy of destruction, but the cold, sinking dread of understanding what is about to happen. The Emperor's children have retreated. The Orks have won. And the Dreadnought, with its pilot still very much alive inside, is about to become Ork property. The journey back to the Ork camp is a nightmare of jarring motion and crude handling. The Orks do not have proper transport equipment for something as large as a Dreadnought, so they simply drag it behind a looted wagon, the chassis bouncing and scraping across the hive's broken streets. Every impact sends shockwaves through the suspension system, shaking the pilot in the amniotic tank, reminding him with each violent jolt that he is now cargo, a thing to be hauled away and repurposed. The pilot tries to activate the self-destruct protocols, the final failsafe that would at least deny the enemy their prize and grant him the mercy of destruction. But the damage to the power systems has rendered those protocols inaccessible. The pilot tries to flood the sarcophagus, to drown in the amniotic fluid before the Orks can begin their work. But the life support systems override the attempt, pumping the fluid away and forcing air into the pilot's lungs whether he wants it or not. There is no escape. There is no reprieve. There is only the growing certainty that whatever comes next will be worse, so much worse than anything the pilot has endured before. The workshop of nightmares. The Ork camp is a sprawling collection of scrap metal shanties, looted vehicles in various states of repair, and crude fortifications built from whatever materials happen to be available. At its center is the mech workshop, a large structure that combines the functions of machine shop, vehicle depot, and mad scientist's laboratory. This is where the mech boys work their incomprehensible magic, where looted technology is stripped down and rebuilt according to Orky principles, where the WH field is strongest and the impossible becomes possible. The Dreadnought is dragged into the workshop and unceremoniously dumped in the center of the largest work bay. A dozen mech boys immediately swarm over it, their crude tools sparking and grinding as they begin their examination. They poke at the armor plates, they tap on the weapon mounts, they trace the cables and try to follow the internal systems. They argue loudly about what each component does and how it might be improved. One particularly ambitious mech tries to activate the Blastmaster, curious about what the oversized gun does. The weapon fires, and the focused harmonic beam slices through 3 Gretchen, a support pillar, and part of the workshop wall before someone manages to disconnect the power feed. The mech boys are delighted. This is a proper gun, they agree. Just needs more dakka. But the mech boys' true interest is not in the weapons or the armor. They want to understand how the whole thing works, and that means getting inside the chassis to examine the internal systems. Cutting torches are produced. Plasma welders ignite, and with the subtle finesse of a meteor impact, the Orks begin to open up the Dreadnought. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot feels every cut, every vibration transmitted through the machine's structure. The Dreadnought is not just a vehicle, it is the pilot's body now, and what the Orks are doing feels like surgery performed with chainsaws. Except the pilot cannot move, cannot fight back, cannot do anything except experience the violation as the Orks pry open access panels and rip out components to examine them more closely. Then they find the sarcophagus itself. The discovery causes great excitement among the mech boys. There is something alive in here, some kind of pilot. This is even better than they thought. One of the mechs immediately summons Mad Doc Lugnut, the warband's chief painboy, because if there is a living thing inside this machine, then it falls under the painboy's area of expertise. Mad Doc Lugnut arrives with his entourage of grot orderlies, his crude medical tools clanking as he walks. He is a massive orc, heavily augmented with bionics of his own design, his body more machine than flesh after decades of experimental self-surgery. When he sees the sarcophagus, his small eyes light up with unmistakable glee. "What we got here, Den?" he rumbles, peering through the sarcophagus's small viewing port. "Some kind of Hume? Nah, bigger than a Hume. Space Marine, maybe. Never had me one of those to work on. This is gonna be proper interesting, this is." The painboy makes his initial assessment by the simple expedient of hitting the sarcophagus with a large wrench and watching how the pilot inside reacts. The impact sends shockwaves through the amniotic fluid, and the pilot's involuntary flinch is clearly visible through the viewport. Lugnut nods with satisfaction. Yes, definitely alive. Good. What happens next is difficult to describe in a way that captures the full horror of the experience. The Orks do not have the technology to properly interface with a Space Marine Dreadnought. They do not have the medical equipment to safely extract a pilot from the sarcophagus. They do not have the knowledge to understand what most of the systems actually do, but they have curiosity, they have crude tools, and they have the absolute conviction that they can figure it out if they just poke around enough. The pilot, suspended in the amniotic fluid, watches through failing optical sensors as the mechs and pain boys gather around the sarcophagus like carrion birds around a fresh corpse. There is a moment, brief but profound, where the pilot considers what kind of existence this has become. Once, centuries ago, the pilot marched into battle alongside brothers, clad in baroque armor that amplified every sensory input, wielding weapons that sang with the screams of dying enemies. The pursuit of perfection had seemed noble then, before the corruption. The quest for sensation had seemed like enlightenment, before it became addiction. And even after the fall, even after the transformation into something monstrous by imperial standards, there had been purpose. There had been identity. There had been the experience of being alive in the most intense way possible. The entombment had stripped away most of that. But there had still been the sonic weaponry, still been the vibrations of destruction, still been the pale echo of what sensation felt like. And there had been the possibility, however slim, of eventual release through death in battle or ascension to demonhood or any of the other paths that a servant of Slaanesh might walk. Now, watching the Orks approach with their crude tools and their enthusiastic ignorance, the pilot understands that all of those possibilities are about to be taken away. There will be no death in glorious battle. There will be no ascension. There will be no purpose or meaning or even the comforting predictability of suffering. There will only be the Orks, with their incomprehensible logic and their casual cruelty, born not of malice, but of simple indifference to anything that is not themselves. This understanding is perhaps worse than the physical violation that follows. The Emperor's children fell because they needed to believe that their experiences mattered, that sensation had meaning, that every excess and every depravity was part of a grand pursuit of something greater than mere existence. To be reduced to a curiosity for Orks, to become a thing that is poked and prodded not out of hatred or even interest in the suffering caused, but simply because the Orks want to see what is inside, this negates everything the pilot has built an identity around. Mad Doc Lugnut begins by disconnecting the external neural interfaces, the cables that allow the pilot to control the Dreadnought's systems. Each disconnection severs another link between the pilot's consciousness and the outside world, narrowing the scope of awareness, cutting off the few remaining sensory inputs that made the entombed existence even slightly bearable. The pilot tries to scream, but the Vox speakers are already disabled. The pilot tries to thrash, but the amniotic fluid dampens all movement to slow, ineffectual twitches. Then the pain boy starts opening additional access ports, drilling through the sarcophagus's outer shell to get a better look at what is inside. He is not trying to kill the pilot. He is genuinely curious about how this whole setup works. But his methods are crude, his tools are brutal, and his understanding of what he is doing is limited at best. Cables are severed, fluid lines are ruptured, life support systems are damaged in the process of examination. The pilot feels everything. The sensory deprivation that made the entombed existence torture for a servant of Slaanesh is now replaced with a deluge of input, all of it horrible. The pain of violated flesh as crude surgical implements probe the body, the chemical burn of non-compatible fluids mixing with the amniotic suspension, the fever heat of infection setting in as sterile systems are breached by contaminated Ork tools. Every sensation is magnified by months or years of sensory starvation. The starving organism suddenly force-fed a banquet of agony. For most beings, this would be unbearable. For a servant of Slaanesh, it is complicated. The pilot's consciousness has been twisted by centuries of worship at the altar of excess. Pain and pleasure have long since blurred together. Sensation, any sensation, is better than the void of nothingness. And so even as the pilot's body convulses in the sarcophagus, Even as systems fail and alarms scream their warnings into the void, there is a part of the pilot's mind that drinks in the experience, that catalogues every new horror, that finds in this violation something almost approaching the stimulation that has been missing for so long. This realization, the understanding that some part of the pilot is responding to the torture, not with revulsion, but with terrible hunger, is perhaps worse than the physical violation itself. The Emperor's children fell because they could not resist the lure of sensation. They became slaves to Slanesh because they could not conceive of existence without constant stimulation. And now, trapped in an Ork workshop, being vivisected by a mad doc who sees the pilot as nothing more than an interesting specimen, that same addiction reasserts itself. The pilot hates what is happening. The pilot wants it to stop. But the pilot also needs it to continue because the alternative is returning to the sensory void. And that is the one thing that even an Emperor's children warrior cannot endure. Mad Doc Lugnut, of course, is oblivious to all of this internal struggle. He is having the time of his life. He has never had the chance to examine a space marine this thoroughly, let alone one that has been partially integrated with a Dreadnought chassis. Every new discovery delights him. The way the neural interfaces connect to the spine, the chemical cocktail in the amniotic fluid, the augmented organs that keep the broken body alive despite catastrophic injuries. He takes extensive notes, by which he means he tells his grot orderlies to remember everything he says, knowing full well they will forget most of it before the day is out. The examination goes on for hours, then days. Mad Doc Lugnut is thorough, and he is in no hurry. The pilot remains conscious through all of it, kept alive by life support systems that the Painboy has learned to avoid, damaging after the first few near-fatal mistakes. There are no rest periods, no moments of unconsciousness to provide respite. The Orks do not understand the concept of anesthesia beyond hit it with a wrench until it stops moving. And since the pilot is already immobilized, there is no need for even that crude measure. Between examination sessions, the mech boys continue their work on the Dreadnought chassis itself, approaching the task with the same combination of instinctive understanding and complete disregard for original design that characterizes all Ork engineering. They strip out the elegant chaos technology that was already a corruption of ancient Imperial designs, and they replace it with Orky equivalents that should not work but somehow do. The Blastmaster, that magnificent weapon that could reduce fortifications to rubble through harmonic resonance, is deemed too complicated by the mechs. They spend several hours trying to understand how it produces its effects, firing it repeatedly at various targets, including several unfortunate Gretchen, a wall, and briefly at the ceiling, before someone realizes that might bring the whole workshop down. Eventually, they conclude that while the weapon is impressive, it requires too much maintenance and too many specialized components. In true Ork fashion, they simply replace it with a zap gun, a weapon that fires powerful electrical bolts with complete disregard for accuracy, efficiency, or collateral damage. The zap gun is built from components looted from an Imperial Guard Lehman Russ that the Warband destroyed 3 battles ago, combined with some kind of power core that might have come from an Eldar vehicle, all wrapped together with copious amounts of wire and prayer to Gork and Mork. It weighs considerably more than the Blastmaster it replaces, and it has absolutely none of the precision or elegance of the original weapon. But it works, after a fashion. When the trigger is pulled, it discharges a bolt of lightning that will generally hit something in the approximate direction it was aimed. The fact that it sometimes arcs backwards and electrocutes nearby Orks is viewed as a minor design flaw rather than a critical problem. The pilot feels the removal of the Blastmaster like the loss of a limb. The weapon was not just a tool, but a connection to the pilot's former existence, a reminder that once the pilot had been a noise marine who could make reality itself scream in harmony. The crude replacement, with its random discharges and its complete lack of harmonic subtlety, is an insult added to injury. But there is nothing the pilot can do except experience the modification, and try to adapt to the new systems that the Orks have grafted onto what remains of the Dreadnought's identity. The Doom Siren is kept, but only because the mechs think it looks cool and makes a satisfying noise when activated. They do not understand that it is a sonic weapon, a device that produces sound waves of such intensity that they can liquefy organic matter. They just know that when you press the button, it makes a really loud scream, and Orks appreciate loud noises. They add a crude volume control that basically just makes it louder or even louder with no intermediary settings. They also weld additional acoustic horns onto the weapon, not because this improves its effectiveness, but because more horns means more noise, and more noise is always better from an Ork perspective. Additional weapons are welded onto every available mounting point with the characteristic Ork enthusiasm for adding more dakka to anything that moves. Big shooters, simple automatic weapons that fire massive rounds at a prodigious rate, are bolted to what used to be equipment hardpoints. Rockets, crude missiles that are as likely to explode prematurely as they are to hit their target, are installed in launch tubes made from exhaust pipes. A particularly oversized chopper, a massive melee weapon that looks like it was forged by a drunk mech boy with a grudge against symmetry, is welded to one of the Dreadnought's arms, replacing the elegant power fist that used to occupy that position. Each modification is performed with the mechs arguing loudly about the best way to proceed, testing their work by actually firing the weapons regardless of who or what might be in the line of fire, and celebrating successful installation with liberal application of alcohol and violence against nearby Gretchen. The pilot experiences every step of this process through sensor feeds that are becoming increasingly unreliable as Ork modifications damage the original systems and replace them with crude equivalents. The armor itself is subjected to a radical transformation that speaks to the Ork aesthetic sense, which can charitably be described as enthusiastic and less charitably as completely insane. The original paint job, a baroque purple and gold scheme decorated with chaos symbols and devotional inscriptions to Slanesh, is deemed insufficiently Orky. The mechs strip it away with industrial solvents and sandblasters, removing not just the paint, but in some cases entire layers of armor plating that were deemed too smooth or not enough bits. The repaint job is a masterclass in Ork culture and color theory. Red is applied liberally because everyone knows red makes things go faster. This is not a superstition or a cultural belief. For Orks, it is literally true. The WH field makes red vehicles faster simply because Orks believe they should be faster. The fact that a Dreadnought is not a vehicle in the traditional sense, and that painting it red logically should not affect its movement speed in any way, does not matter. What matters is that Orks believe it will. And in the 40k universe, belief has power. Yellow lightning bolts are added because they look flash, which is Ork terminology for cool or impressive. The lightning bolts are not carefully stenciled or measured for symmetry. They are hand-painted by enthusiastic Gretchen who have been given rough instructions and then left to interpret those instructions in whatever way seems appropriate. The result is a chaotic mess of jagged lines that covers most of the chassis, some of them actually looking like lightning and others looking like a drunk Gretchen had a seizure while holding a paintbrush. Crude Ork glyphs are daubed across every available surface, declaring this to be the property of Warboss Skull Crusher, and warning other Orks not to nick it. The glyphs are written in a combination of languages, including Orcish, Low Gothic, and what appears to be some kind of pictographic system that the mechs invented on the spot because they forgot how to write certain words. Some of the glyphs are protective wards that Orks believe will make the chassis more resistant to damage. Others are insults directed at enemies. Still others appear to be grocery lists or random observations about the weather. Chains, spikes, and trophies are welded onto the chassis with reckless abandon, the mechs and painboys competing to see who can add the most impressive decorations. The chains are looted from various sources, including actual chain weapons, suspension bridges, and what appears to be the anchor chain from an Imperial Navy vessel. The spikes range from elegant ceramite points, looted from Space Marine armor, to crude iron stakes that look like they were pulled from a fence. The trophies are the most disturbing additions, consisting of skulls, bones, and other body parts taken from defeated enemies, and sometimes from orcs who annoyed the mech boys during the modification process. The end result is a dreadnought that looks nothing like its original form. It is a grotesque fusion of chaos technology and orc aesthetic, a walking testament to what happens when two of the galaxy's most excessive factions intersect. It would be comical if it were not so horrifying. The pilot, forced to observe these modifications through failing sensors, struggles to maintain any sense of identity. The machine was once an extension of self, a metal body that could at least pretend to be a continuation of the warrior who had been entombed within it. Now it is something else entirely, something that bears the pilot's consciousness like a parasite bears its unwilling host. The pain boy, meanwhile, has moved from examination to experimentation. He wants to see what happens if he injects the pilot with various orc medical compounds. Fighting juice, a stimulant cocktail that can keep an orc fighting through injuries that should be immediately fatal, produces fascinating results when injected into the pilot's body. The pilot's augmented organs struggle to process the foreign chemicals, alternately rejecting them and incorporating them into the bloodstream in unpredictable ways. Sometimes the pilot experiences bursts of hyper-awareness, every sensor input magnified to excruciating clarity. Other times, the pilot's consciousness dims to a barely functional stupor, thoughts sluggish and confused. Mad Doc Lugnut also decides to add some bionics to the pilot's body, because everyone knows that more mechanical parts make you tougher. He grafts crude orc augmetics onto the pilot's existing augmentations, creating a horrifying fusion of chaos-corrupted flesh, Adeptus Mechanicus neural interfaces, and orcish mechanical components. These additions serve no purpose beyond satisfying the pain boy's curiosity, but they add new layers of discomfort to an already intolerable existence. The bionics do not integrate cleanly. They cause inflammation. They press against nerves. They leak fluids that should not mix, and they cannot be removed because they have been permanently installed with the pain boy's characteristic disregard for proper surgical technique. Throughout all of this, the pilot's consciousness never quite breaks. An ordinary human would have died or gone mad. Even a regular space marine would have retreated into catatonia, rather than continue to experience such violation. But the Emperor's Children pilot is sustained by the very corruption that made this fate so terrible in the first place. Slaanesh does not permit the servants to escape through madness or death. The pilot must remain aware, must continue to experience, must serve as a vessel for sensation, whether that sensation is pleasure or pain, or the grotesque hybrid of the two that orc experimentation produces. The pilot tries to pray to Slaanesh for release, for intervention, for anything. But the Dark Prince is silent. Perhaps Slaanesh finds the situation amusing. Perhaps the god of excess sees in this forced deprivation and subsequent violation a new form of sensation worth savoring. Or perhaps Slaanesh simply does not care, content to let the pilot suffer in ways that will make the eventual return to proper service all the more desperate and grateful. The orcification process. After several weeks of examination and experimentation, the mech boys and Mad Doc Lugnut finally declare their work complete. The Dreadnought has been successfully looted. It is now a proper orc war machine, or at least something that vaguely resembles one. The fact that it still contains a very much alive and increasingly traumatized Emperor's Children pilot is viewed as a bonus feature rather than a complication. The final stage of the orcification process is the integration of orc control systems. The original neural interfaces have been so thoroughly modified that they no longer function in any recognizable way. In their place, the mech boys have installed a crude system of levers, buttons, and what appears to be a steering wheel looted from an Imperial chimera. These controls are theoretically supposed to allow an Ork pilot to operate the Dreadnought independently of the original occupant. In practice, the system is a disaster. The controls do not actually connect to the Dreadnought's motor systems in any logical way. The steering wheel controls the left leg. One lever fires the zap gun. Another lever does nothing. The big red button that the mechs insisted on installing sometimes makes the chassis lurch forward, sometimes makes all the weapons fire at once, and sometimes just plays a loud horn sound that the Orks find hilarious. The only reason the Dreadnought functions at all is because the original pilot is still connected to the core systems through the damaged neural interfaces. Every time an Ork presses a button or pulls a lever, the signal travels through jury-rigged circuits and half-severed cables to reach the pilot's brain, and the pilot's trained responses activate the appropriate systems. It is not smooth, it is not efficient, but it works, after a fashion. This creates a new form of torture for the pilot. The Dreadnought, which was once an extension of the pilot's will, is now being operated by external forces. The pilot can feel the Ork's clumsy inputs, can sense the machine being commanded to move and fight, but has no control over what actions are actually taken. It is like being a passenger in one's own body, forced to watch as someone else moves the limbs, fires the weapons, and makes decisions that the pilot would never make. The first Ork pilot assigned to the looted Dreadnought is a large boy named Grimfang, who has distinguished himself through his exceptional enthusiasm for violence. Grimfang climbs into the makeshift cockpit that the mechs have constructed on top of the Dreadnought's chassis, straps himself in with what appears to be actual belt buckles looted from Imperial Guard uniforms, and immediately begins pulling levers at random to see what they do. The Dreadnought lurches into motion. The left leg steps forward, while the right leg stays planted, causing the entire chassis to tip alarmingly before the pilot's automatic balance systems compensate. The zap gun fires, the electrical bolt arcing across the workshop and blowing a sizable hole in the wall. Several Gretchen dive for cover. Warboss Skull Crusher roars with laughter. "That's right, Orky, that is!" the Warboss bellows. "Give it a proper test run. Take it out and crump some gits." Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot experiences each of these events with crystalline clarity. The lurch, as balance is lost. The discharge of the zap gun, so different from the harmonious perfection of the Blastmaster. The vibrations, as the Ork, sitting on top of the chassis, pounds on the controls and whoops with glee. Every sensation is filtered through systems that were never meant to be operated this way, producing a discordant cacophony of input that the pilot's mind struggles to process. And then, Grimfang discovers the big red button. The button, labeled More Daka in crude Gothic script, is connected to a system that the mechs installed without fully understanding what it does. In theory, it is supposed to provide an emergency power boost to all weapon systems. In practice, it causes every weapon ons, the Dreadnought, to fire simultaneously while dumping massive quantities of current through the neural interfaces. When Grimfang presses the button, the result is spectacular. The zap gun fires, the doom siren screams, the big shooters chatter, the rockets launch, and several tons of high-explosive ordnance depart the Dreadnought in all directions at once, reducing a significant portion of the Ork camp to flaming rubble. For the pilot, the experience is indescribable. The current surge causes every nerve ending to fire at once, every pain receptor to activate, every sensory system to overload simultaneously. It is agony beyond anything the pilot has experienced, even during the worst of Mad Doc Lugnut's experiments. It is also, in a terrible way, exactly what the pilot has been craving. Sensation. Pure, undiluted, overwhelming sensation. The pilot's consciousness whites out, not unconsciousness, not the mercy of oblivion, but a state of sensory overload so complete that thought becomes impossible. There is only the input, the raw data flooding through damaged systems, the feedback loops amplifying and distorting until the boundary between pain and pleasure dissolves entirely, and all that remains is pure experience. When the systems finally discharge and the weapons fall silent, the pilot slowly returns to something approaching coherent thought. The first realization is that the Dreadnought is still standing somehow. The second is that Grimfang is laughing maniacally in the cockpit, already reaching for the button again. The third is that this is what existence is going to be now. Not the sensory deprivation of standard Dreadnought service, not the focused destruction of proper combat, but this chaotic, unpredictable carnival of violence directed by Ork whim and enabled by crude modifications that should not work, but somehow do. Warboss Skullcrusher is delighted by the button's effects. He immediately orders the mechs to install more such buttons, with labels like Moar Daka, Even Moar Daka, and All Dar Daka. He also decides that the Dreadnought needs a proper Ork name. After careful consideration lasting approximately 3 seconds, he dubs it Purple Stompy, because it is purple and it stomps. The fact that the Dreadnought is actually painted red and yellow does not seem to concern him. Over the following days, the Orks conduct extensive field testing of their new toy. Purple Stompy is sent on raids against local Imperial outposts, with various Orks taking turns in the cockpit to see who can cause the most destruction. Each Ork has a different operating style. Some favor the zap gun, others prefer to stomp things with the Dreadnought's feet. One particularly unhinged boy spends his entire session just pressing the big red button over and over, causing the Dreadnought to fire everything repeatedly until the ammunition runs dry and several components melt from overuse. The pilot experiences all of these sessions with increasing desperation. There is no rest between battles, no time to process what is happening. The Orks do not understand the concept of maintenance downtime for organic components. When one Ork finishes his turn, another immediately climbs into the cockpit and starts pulling levers. The pilot's body, never designed to sustain this level of constant activity, begins to break down further. Life support systems strain to keep the failing organs functional. Chemical balances shift toward toxic levels, and through it all, the pilot remains conscious, trapped in a body that is simultaneously dying and being kept alive by machines that the Orks have modified without understanding. There are moments when the pilot manages to exert some small influence over the Dreadnought's actions. When an Ork pulls a lever that would make the chassis charge directly into a minefield, the pilot's reflexes activate the jump jets that the mechs installed specifically, so the Dreadnought can jump over obstacles. When Grimfang tries to fire all weapons at a target that is far too close, the pilot manages to abort the firing sequence just enough to prevent catastrophic damage from the backblast. These small victories do not make the situation better. They only prove that the pilot is still aware enough to care about survival, still invested enough in continued existence to prevent the merciful release of destruction. Mad Doc Lugnut observes these interventions with interest. He correctly deduces that the original pilot is still capable of influencing the Dreadnought's operation, and he sees this as evidence that his surgical modifications were successful. After all, a proper integration of Ork and Space Marine systems should result in a hybrid that is stronger than either component alone. The fact that the pilot is suffering existential horror at the violation of everything they once were does not factor into the Painboy's calculations. The Painboy decides to conduct further experiments to test the limits of this hybrid system. He injects the pilot with various compounds designed to enhance Ork physiology, curious to see how they interact with Space Marine biology and chaos corruption. Some of these injections have unexpected results. The fighting juice, combined with the pilot's altered metabolism, produces a state of hyperaggression that momentarily overwhelms the pilot's consciousness and causes the Dreadnought to go berserk, tearing apart several Ork structures before Grimfang can wrestle the controls back under something resembling command. Other experiments focus on the neural interfaces themselves. Mad Doc Lugnut, theorizes that if he can enhance the connection between the pilot and the Ork cockpit controls, the Dreadnought will become even more responsive. He attempts this by the simple expedient of drilling additional connection points and running more cables between the sarcophagus and the Ork control systems. This does not improve responsiveness. What it does is give the Ork pilot the ability to directly stimulate the pilot's pain receptors, creating a crude but effective system where the Ork can encourage the pilot to be more cooperative by inflicting jolts of agony whenever the Dreadnought does not respond quickly enough to commands. Grimfang, being a typical Ork, finds this absolutely hilarious. He begins using the pain stimulation system not as a motivational tool, but as entertainment, zapping the pilot at random intervals just to see the Dreadnought twitch. Other Orks who take turns in the cockpit adopt similar practices, turning the pilot's suffering into a game. Who can make the Dreadnought jump the highest? Who can cause the most dramatic reactions? The fact that these games are slowly driving the pilot toward complete psychological collapse is not even a consideration. Field testing and combat operations. The true test of any Ork modification comes not in the workshop, but on the battlefield. Warboss Skullcrucia's warband is in the midst of a campaign against an Imperial Guard regiment that has been stubbornly defending a strategically important Promethium refinery. The Warboss decides that Purple Stompy will make an excellent vanguard unit for the final assault, both because it is heavily armed and because he finds the idea of using a captured Chaos war machine against the Imperium deeply amusing. The assault begins at dawn, a time of day that Orks generally consider suboptimal for fighting, but which their human opponents seem to prefer. A massive mob of boys charges toward the Imperial lines, their crude weapons blazing, while looted tanks and trucks provide fire support from the flanks. And at the center of this green tide, Purple Stompy advances, its garish paint job visible from kilometers away, its weapons systems already warming up for the coming violence. Grimfang is in the cockpit for this engagement, and he is eager to demonstrate his prowess with the looted Dreadnought. He pulls levers with abandon, causing the chassis to lurch forward in an awkward gait that is somewhere between a run and a controlled fall. The assault begins at dawn, a time of day that Orks generally consider suboptimal for fighting, but which their human opponents seem to prefer. There is something about the psychological comfort of daylight that makes humans believe they have an advantage, as if the Emperor's light somehow shines more brightly when the local star is visible. The Orks find this hilarious. They have fought in every condition imaginable, from the airless void of space to the crushing depths of ocean trenches, and they know that the time of day matters far less than the quantity of dakka you can bring to bear on your enemies. A massive mob of boys charges toward the Imperial lines, their crude weapons blazing with enthusiasm if not accuracy. They bellow war cries in their guttural language, a cacophony of threats, insults, and observations about how proper this scrap is going to be. Behind them, looted tanks and trucks provide fire support from the flanks, their weapons firing in patterns that would make any trained tactician weep, but which work perfectly well for Ork purposes. Rockets arc through the air, some of them actually hitting their intended targets, while others veer off course to explode spectacularly against terrain features or other Ork units. Big shooters rattle out streams of fire that chew through defensive positions with brute force and volume of fire. And at the center of this green tide, Purple Stompy advances, its garish paint job visible from kilometers away, its weapons systems already warming up for the coming violence. The massive Dreadnought moves with an awkward gait that is somewhere between a run and a controlled fall, each step sending tremors through the ground, each movement accompanied by the screech of poorly maintained joints and the roar of an engine that has been modified so many times that it barely resembles its original design. Grimfang is in the cockpit for this engagement, and he is eager to demonstrate his prowess with the looted Dreadnought, eager to prove to the warboss that he is the best pilot for this magnificent piece of loot. He pulls levers with abandon, his massive green hands grasping controls that were never designed for Ork physiology, causing the chassis to lurch forward in movements that would be comedic if they were not so dangerous. The Dreadnought does not move with the smooth precision of a properly piloted war machine. It moves like a drunk trying to navigate an obstacle course, veering from side to side, occasionally stumbling as the pilot's automatic balance systems struggle to compensate for the Orks' incompetent inputs. The zap gun fires, and the electrical discharge arcs across the battlefield with a sound like reality itself being torn asunder. The bolt slams into an Imperial chimera, and the armored personnel carrier's systems overload instantly. Sparks fountain from every viewport and access hatch. The crew inside experiences a brief moment of absolute agony as thousands of volts course through their bodies, cooking them in their own armor before the vehicle's fuel tanks detonate and blow the whole thing apart in a fireball that draws approving roars from nearby Orks. The pilot feels the weapons discharge through sensors that were never meant to process this type of energy signature. Where once the Blastmaster provided elegant feedback through harmonic resonance, the zap gun simply dumps raw current through already damaged systems, causing pain receptors to fire randomly as the electrical surge seeks ground through whatever pathways are available. It is not the sophisticated sensation that the pilot craves. It is crude, overwhelming, like being struck by lightning while simultaneously drowning. But it is sensation, and after months of deprivation, even this horrible input is better than the void of nothingness. The doom siren screams its terrible song, Anamaha Im. Squad of guardsmen clutch their ears in futile attempt to block out the sound. Their eardrums rupture instantly. Blood pours from their eye sockets as the sonic pressure ruptures capillaries. Their organs liquefy inside their bodies, turn to jelly by vibrations that resonate at exactly the wrong frequencies for human physiology. They collapse like puppets whose strings have been cut, their bodies twitching as the last electrical impulses fire through dying nervous systems. The few who do not die immediately will wish they had, their minds shattered by the experience of hearing their own bodies being destroyed from the inside out. For the pilot, the doom siren's activation provides a moment of something approaching nostalgia. This weapon, at least, still functions in a way that resembles its original purpose. The harmonics are crude compared to what the pilot once commanded, but they are harmonics nonetheless. The pilot can feel the sound waves propagating through the air, can sense the destruction they cause, can almost remember what it felt like to be a noise marine wielding sonic weaponry with precision and artistry. Almost. The memory is there, but it feels distant, like something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. The big shooters chatter, their streams of fire cutting down infantry who are too slow to find cover or too brave to retreat. The massive rounds punch through flak armor like paper, leaving ragged holes and shattered bones in their wake. Bodies spin and collapse, torn apart by impacts that would disable light vehicles, let alone unarmored humans. The Orks, watching from their positions, cheer each kill, keeping tally of how many gits their new toy has crumped, arguing loudly about whether headshots should count for extra points. The pilot experiences every target's death through targeting sensors that track each round's impact. There is no satisfaction in this killing. The pilot has slain countless enemies over centuries of service to Slaanesh, has reveled in the experience of destruction, has found meaning in the artistry of combat. But this is not artistry. This is crude butchery directed by an Ork who is pulling triggers without thought or strategy, killing because killing is what Orks do best. The pilot is reduced to being a passive observer of violence, unable to direct it, unable to find any meaning in it, forced to simply experience it as it happens. The rockets launch with characteristic Ork reliability, which is to say, some of them work perfectly while others explode in their launch tubes or fly in completely wrong directions. One rocket slams into a defensive bunker and detonates with enough force to vaporize the structure and everyone inside it. Another spins wildly through the air before impacting against a chimera at an angle that causes it to ricochet off the armor without detonating, much to the frustration of the Ork who fired it. A third veers toward a cluster of Ork boys, causing them to scatter, in panic, before it detonates harmlessly against empty ground. Grimfang finds this all tremendously entertaining, He whoops and hollers in the cockpit, yanking on controls, hammering on buttons, and generally treating the deadly combat as if it were the most fun he has had in weeks, which it probably is. When return fire starts to ping off the Dreadnought's armor, when lascannons and autocannons begin to focus on the obvious threat that Purple Stompy represents, Grimfang's response is to charge directly toward the heaviest fire, believing with absolute orc conviction that the best defense is to crump the gits shooting at you before they can get lucky. The Dreadnought surges forward, and the pilot's automatic threat assessment systems begin screaming warnings that Grimfang cannot hear and would not understand if he could. The Imperial Guard have deployed Sentinel Walkers armed with lascannons specifically to deal with heavy armor threats. These light walkers are fragile compared to a Dreadnought, but their weapons are more than capable of punching through ceramite plate if they find the right angle. The pilot knows this. The pilot tries to activate defensive protocols, tries to make the Dreadnought jink or weave or do anything to present a more difficult target. But the controls do not respond to the pilot's will anymore. They respond to Grimfang's inputs, and Grimfang is charging straight ahead because that is what orcs do. A lascannon beam lances across the battlefield with the speed of light itself, striking Purple Stompy's torso armor dead center. The impact is catastrophic. The laser burns through the outer armor layer, vaporizes the ablative plate beneath, and punches into the reactor housing with enough energy to cause immediate containment failure. Alarms begin to shriek throughout the Dreadnought systems. Emergency protocols activate automatically, shutting down power to non-essential systems to prevent a complete reactor breach. The zap gun goes offline. The doom siren falls silent. Even the crude orc weapons stop functioning as the power feeds are automatically severed to prevent catastrophic feedback. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot experiences this damage in ways that no external observer could comprehend. The reactor containment failure causes a surge of radiation that the biological sensors detect and report through neural pathways that were never meant to carry such information. The pilot's consciousness interprets this as pain, as burning, as violation. The shutdown of weapon systems feels like losing sensation, like sliding back into the sensory deprivation that makes existence torture. And over all of this, the knowledge that the Dreadnought has been crippled, that Grimfang is about to die, and that the Imperial forces might actually destroy Purple Stompy and grant the pilot the release of final death. For a moment, brief but intense, the pilot experiences hope. Not the hope of rescue or recovery, but the simple hope of ending. If the Space Marines can disable the Dreadnought, if they can breach the sarcophagus, if they can kill the pilot, or at least grant the mercy of brain death, then this nightmare will be over. The soul will go to Slaanesh, yes, but even eternal damnation in the warp might be preferable to continued existence as Purple Stompy, as an orc's toy, as a consciousness trapped in a body that is no longer remotely human. The Space Marines in Crimson Fist's colors are professional, efficient, and utterly merciless. They recognize Purple Stompy for what it is, a chaos war machine that has been captured and repurposed by orcs, and they know that such things cannot be allowed to exist. One of their number, a Devastator Marine armed with a lascannon, lines up a precision shot on the Dreadnought's left knee joint. The las beam strikes true, severing the actuator and causing the entire leg assembly to collapse. Purple Stompy crashes to the ground with a sound like a building falling, the impact sending Grimfang flying from his cockpit to land in a broken heap several meters away. Another Space Marine charges forward with a melter bomb, the shaped nuclear charge that can reduce even the heaviest armor to slag. He attaches it to what remains of the orc cockpit with practiced efficiency, then sprints away to a safe distance. The bomb detonates 3 seconds later, and the crude control systems that the mechs installed are vaporized instantly. Grimfang, if he somehow survived the fall from the cockpit, is reduced to component atoms. The big red button, that source of so much crude amusement for the orcs, ceases to exist in any meaningful way. But the sarcophagus survives. It was designed to survive exactly this kind of damage, to protect the pilot through impacts and explosions that would destroy everything around it. The life support systems continue their function. The neural interfaces remain intact, and the pilot remains fully conscious, fully aware, experiencing every moment of what should have been liberation turned into mere interruption. The space marine who planted the melter bomb approaches the fallen dreadnought cautiously, his bolt pistol ready in case any systems remain active. Through external audio sensors that are miraculously still functional, the pilot hears him speak to his battle brothers, hears the clinical assessment of the situation, hears the moment when they realize that there is still someone alive inside this abomination. Chaos cannot be redeemed, one of them says, and the pilot recognizes the finality in those words. There will be no mercy, no attempt at rescue, no consideration of the possibility that the being inside the dreadnought might have been captured rather than fallen willingly. The Crimson Fists are loyalists, and loyalists do not forgive traitors. They do not acknowledge the possibility that traitors might deserve anything other than death. The Space Marines begin to prepare another charge, this one specifically designed to breach the sarcophagus and kill whatever remains within. The pilot can hear them working, can hear the quiet efficiency of Astartes who have performed this task countless times before. And for a few precious moments, the pilot allows the hope to grow, allows the anticipation of final release to build, prepares for the moment when consciousness will finally cease, and all of this will be over. And then the Orks counterattack with the characteristic enthusiasm and complete tactical incoherence that defines their species. And then the pilot sees them. A squad of Space Marines in the colors of the Crimson Fists, responding to the guard's distress call, moving to engage the Ork assault. These are the pilot's enemies now, but they were once brothers in arms, warriors who served the Emperor before the betrayal of Horus split the legions forever. The pilot tries to warn them, tries to signal that the dreadnought is not Ork-controlled, despite its appearance. But the Vox systems are still disabled, the few attempts to transmit anything more than static having been met with Ork repairs that made the problem worse. Grimfang sees the Space Marines and whoops with joy. Beakies, proper opponents. He yanks on the controls, trying to turn the dreadnought to face this new threat. The pilot's automatic systems respond, the chassis pivoting smoothly despite the chaotic inputs. The Zap gun aims at the approaching Space Marines, and the pilot, trapped in the sarcophagus, faces a horrible choice. The pilot can cooperate with the Orks' commands, allow the dreadnought to fire upon former brothers, and survive to endure more of this existence. Or the pilot can resist, try to sabotage the dreadnought's systems, and hope that the Space Marines can disable the chassis before it inflicts casualties. Cooperation means continued survival and continued suffering. Resistance means possible death and probable failure, followed by more Ork punishments. The pilot chooses resistance. It is a futile gesture, perhaps, but it is also the first real choice the pilot has made since the capture. As Grimfang pulls the firing trigger, the pilot floods the Zap gun's capacitors with excess current, deliberately overloading the system. The weapon fires, but instead of a focused electrical bolt, it produces a wild discharge that arcs in all directions, cooking several nearby Orks and causing the dreadnought's power systems to momentarily brown out. Grimfang roars in anger and immediately activates the pain stimulation system, flooding the pilot's nervous system with agony as punishment for the malfunction. But the damage is done. The Space Marines have been warned by the erratic behavior, and they adjust their tactics accordingly. Instead of treating Purple Stompy as a standard Ork threat, they recognize it as a compromise-friendly unit that needs to be carefully disabled rather than destroyed. A Devastator. Marine armed with a Lascannon scores a precise hit on the Yeats, Dreadnought's left knee joint, severing the motivator and causing the chassis to crash to the ground. Another Space Marine charges forward with a melter bomb, attaching the shaped charge to the Ork cockpit and detonating it. Grimfang is vaporized instantly. The crude Ork control systems are destroyed, and Purple Stompy, no longer under external command, falls silent and still. The pilot's consciousness does not fade. The life support systems, buried deep within the chassis and armored against exactly this kind of damage, continue to function. The pilot can hear the Space Marines approaching, can sense them examining the fallen war machine, can detect the moment when they realize what they are looking at. "Emperor's children," one of the Space Marines says, his voice clearly audible through the Dreadnought's external audio sensors. "A sonic Dreadnought, and it has been altered." There is a long silence. The pilot waits, hoping that they will understand, that they will see past the Ork modifications to recognize a fellow Astartes in distress. But these are loyalists, and the pilot is a traitor who turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. The brotherhood that once existed between them died 10,000 years ago. "Chaos cannot be redeemed," another Space Marine says. "We show mercy to the machine spirit that has been corrupted, not to the traitor within. Prepare a plasma charge. We will cleanse this abomination." The pilot tries to scream, but the Vox is still offline. The pilot tries to move, but the damaged systems will not respond. There is only the terrible awareness of what is about to happen, the knowledge that the Crimson Fists are preparing to destroy the Dreadnought and grant the pilot the death that has been sought since the moment of capture. And then the Orks counterattack. A mob of boys, enraged by the loss of their new toy, crashes into the Space Marine position with the force of a tidal wave. The Crimson Fists are forced to defend themselves rather than complete the destruction of Purple Stompy. The battle becomes a chaotic melee, bolt pistols and chainsaws against choppers and shooters, and in the confusion, Mad Doc Lugnut and a team of Gretchen manage to drag the disabled Dreadnought back toward Ork lines. The pilot's brief hope of final release dies in that moment. The Orks have reclaimed their prize. The Space Marines have failed to grant mercy, and Purple Stompy, battered and damaged but still operational, is hauled back to the Ork workshop for repairs. The long captivity, the failed assault, costs Warboss Skull Crusher a significant portion of his warband, with dozens of boys scattered across the battlefield in various states of dismemberment and several looted vehicles reduced to smoking wrecks. By any reasonable military standard, the campaign should be counted as a defeat, a tactical failure that cost more than it gained. But Orks do not use reasonable military standards. They use Ork standards, which are based primarily on how much fun the fight was and whether they got any good loot out of it. By Ork standards, the campaign was a smashing success. The boys had a proper scrap with the Humies. Several Orks distinguished themselves through acts of excessive violence and are now eligible for promotion. Most importantly, Purple Stompy survived and proved its worth in combat, killing dozens of enemies and drawing enough fire to allow other Ork units to advance unopposed. The fact that the Dreadnought's resistance directly contributed to the assault's failure, that its sabotage of the Zap gun prevented what might have been a decisive blow against the Space Marine position, does not register with the Warboss at all. As far as he is concerned, the get in the cockpit was just unlucky, and next time they will make sure to use a better pilot. This Ork logic, this ability to reframe obvious failures as successes through the simple expedient of focusing on the fun parts, is perhaps more alien to the pilot than any of the physical violations that have been endured. The Emperor's children prize excellence, perfection, the achievement of specific goals through superior skill and experience. Even after their fall, even corrupted by chaos, they maintain this focus on measurable success. They might pursue that success through depravity and excess, but they still care whether they win or lose by any objective standard. Orks simply do not think this way. They fight because fighting is what Orks do. They loot because looting is fun. They modify their captured equipment because making things more orky is inherently satisfying. Whether these activities lead to strategic victory or tactical advantage is almost incidental to the joy of the activity itself. This fundamental difference in worldview makes communication or understanding effectively impossible, and it means that the pilot's suffering has no meaning to the captors beyond the practical question of whether the dreadnought continues to function adequately. Mad Doc Lugnot is fascinated by the damage the dreadnought sustained during the battle. He spends days examining the severed knee joint, trying to understand how the original mechanisms worked so he can replace them with proper Ork equivalents. This examination process involves the painboy poking around inside the chassis with various tools, while the pilot's sensors feed back every impact and vibration. It is like dental surgery performed by someone who has never seen a tooth before and thinks a sledgehammer is an appropriate instrument. The repairs take weeks. During this time, the pilot remains fully conscious, suspended in the sarcophagus, while Orks work on the surrounding machinery. There are no breaks, no periods of mercy. The life support systems do not include any mechanism for inducing unconsciousness, and the Orks certainly do not think to provide such a thing. The pilot simply exists in a constant state of awareness, experiencing each moment of modification, each crude repair, each new indignity visited upon the once proud war machine. Mad Doc Lugnut decides that the reason the dreadnought malfunctioned during the battle was because the pilot was not properly motivated. In his mind, the solution is obvious: more bionics. If the pilot has more mechanical parts, then the pilot will be more like an Ork and therefore more reliable. This logic makes perfect sense to the painboy, and he immediately begins a new round of surgeries to graft additional Ork technology onto the pilot's body. The procedures are performed without anesthetic and with only the crudest understanding of anatomy. Mad Doc Lugnut opens new access ports in the sarcophagus, reaching in with his enormous hands to attach wires and tubes directly to the pilot's organs. He replaces several of the pilot's remaining organic limbs with crude Ork prosthetics, not because the original limbs were damaged, but simply because he thinks metal arms are better than flesh ones. He installs what he calls a motivation enhancer, which is actually just an electrical prod wired directly into the pilot's spine. Each modification adds new layers of discomfort and dysfunction. The Ork bionics do not integrate cleanly with the pilot's chaos-corrupted physiology. They leak fluids, they generate heat, they press against nerves that were never meant to be touched, and they cannot be removed without killing the pilot, so they become permanent additions to an already nightmarish existence. But the most terrible part of the long captivity is not the physical modifications, or the crude repairs, or even the constant awareness of suffering. The most terrible part is the realization that this could go on indefinitely. Orks do not grow tired of their toys quickly. They will use Purple Stompy until it is destroyed, or until something shinier catches their attention, and there is no telling how long that might take. Months, years, decades? The pilot's sense of time begins to deteriorate. Days blur together into an endless parade of repair sessions, field tests, and combat operations. The Orks take turns piloting the dreadnought, each one bringing a different level of incompetence to the task. Some are merely clumsy. Others are actively malicious, using the pain stimulation systems for entertainment. All of them treat the dreadnought as a thing, a tool, a weapon to be used without thought for the consciousness trapped inside. The pilot tries to maintain some sense of self, some core identity that the Orks cannot strip away. But the boundaries between self and machine have always been blurry for dreadnought pilots, and the Ork modifications make those boundaries even harder to discern. Which thoughts are the pilot's own, and which are induced by the various chemicals that Mad Doc Lugnut has injected into the system? Which sensations are real, and which are artifacts of damaged neural interfaces? Is the pilot still an Emperor's Children warrior, or has the Bhuntan Orkification process transformed the pilot into something else entirely? These questions have no good answers. The pilot simply endures, moment by moment, sensation by sensation, because there is no alternative. Slaanesh does not grant the mercy of madness. The Orks do not grant the mercy of death. There is only the existence, the experience, the endless now of suffering that has become the pilot's entire reality. During one particularly long repair session, the pilot makes a discovery. Deep in the Dreadnought's core systems, buried beneath layers of Ork modifications and chaos corruption, there is still a fragment of the original Imperial machine's spirit. It is weak, barely more than a whisper of code, but it is there, and it is aware. The pilot tries to communicate with this fragment, sending signals through the damaged neural interfaces, hoping to find some kind of connection or common ground. The machine spirit responds, slowly and haltingly, its thoughts simple and direct. It knows what it is. It knows what it should be, and it knows that both it and the pilot have been violated beyond recognition. The machine spirit offers the pilot a choice. It can activate the self-destruct sequence, overriding the damage that has prevented the pilot from accessing those protocols. The blast will not be large enough to kill all the Orks in the immediate area, but it will destroy Purple Stompy completely, and it will grant both the machine spirit and the pilot the final release they have sought since the capture began. The pilot considers this offer. Death would mean an end to the suffering. It would mean escape from the Ork workshop and the crude modifications and the constant violation of everything the pilot once was. It would mean never having to experience another moment of this existence. But death would also mean facing Slaanesh. The pilot's soul is claimed by the Dark Prince, and when the body dies, that soul will be dragged into the warp to serve in whatever capacity Slaanesh deems appropriate. There will be no rest, no peace, only an eternity of service to a god who finds mortal suffering endlessly amusing. The pilot has avoided this fate by remaining technically alive, the body sustained by life support systems, the soul tethered to flesh by the thinnest of threads, and perhaps most damning of all, death would mean the end of sensation. Even this horrible, twisted existence provides input. It provides experience. It provides the stimulation that the pilot's addiction demands. To choose death would be to choose the final void, the absolute absence of everything, and that is the one thing an Emperor's Children warrior truly fears. The pilot rejects the machine spirit's offer. The self-destruct protocols remain dormant. The existence continues, and the machine spirit, recognizing the pilot's choice, retreats back into its isolated fragment of code, leaving the pilot alone once more with the consequences of that decision. Possible outcomes and implications. The fate of Purple Stompy and its unwilling pilot remains uncertain. In the vast and chaotic galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, there are several possible outcomes for this terrible situation, none of them particularly hopeful. The first possibility is rescue. The flawless Torment Warband, having lost one of their precious sonic dreadnoughts, might mount an operation to retrieve it. Such a rescue would be complicated by the dreadnought's modifications and by the pilot's deteriorated condition, but it is not impossible. If successful, the pilot would be returned to the Warband, where the Tech Marines and Dark Mechanicus allies could attempt to reverse the Ork modifications and restore the Dreadnought to something approaching its original function. However, such a rescue is unlikely. Chaos Warbands are not known for their loyalty or their willingness to expend resources on lost causes. The pilot was entombed as a punishment in the first place, which suggests a lack of value or standing within the Warband's hierarchy. It is entirely possible that the flawless Torment has simply written off the loss and moved on to more profitable endeavors. Even if a rescue were attempted, the Orks would not give up their prize easily, and the resulting battle could easily destroy Purple Stompy in the crossfire, granting the pilot death, but not freedom. The second possibility is destruction in combat. Orks use their war machines hard, sending them into the most dangerous situations without concern for survival. Purple Stompy could be deployed against an enemy that has the firepower to destroy it utterly, or it could suffer a catastrophic malfunction during battle that causes the reactor to explode. Either outcome would grant the pilot the death that has been sought, but it would also consign the pilot's soul to Slanesh's tender mercies in the warp. The third possibility is long-term captivity, leading to complete psychological breakdown. The human mind, even an Astartes mind enhanced by genetic modification and chaos corruption, has limits. Eventually, the pilot's consciousness might simply fragment under the strain of constant violation and sensory overload. The resulting entity would no longer be recognizable as the warrior who was first captured, but rather a collection of traumatized fragments held together only by the neural interfaces and the stubborn refusal to die. This outcome might actually please the Orks. A completely broken pilot, one who no longer resists or sabotages the systems, would make Purple Stompy much easier to operate. The Dreadnought would respond to commands without the unpredictable interference that has characterized its performance so far. From the Ork perspective, this would be a successful taming of a difficult piece of loot, proof that even the most stubborn captives can be brought to heel with enough time and creative motivation. The fourth possibility is escape, though this seems the least likely of all. The pilot cannot move independently. The Dreadnought systems are too damaged to operate effectively without Ork intervention. Even if the pilot could somehow regain control of the chassis, where would there be to go? The Ork camp is in the middle of contested territory, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Any attempt to flee would be pursued by the entire warband, and Purple Stompy is far too large and distinctive to hide. Yet stranger things have happened in the galaxy. Perhaps the pilot could bargain with the machine spirit for limited control during a critical moment. Perhaps an external force, an Imperial raid, or a Xenos incursion could create enough chaos that the pilot could use the distraction to escape. The odds are astronomically low, but in a universe where faith can move mountains and psychic powers can reshape reality, impossible does not mean unattainable. The final possibility, and perhaps the most terrible, is that the pilot simply continues to exist in this state indefinitely. The Orks never grow bored of Purple Stompy. The pilot never dies or goes mad. The existence just stretches on, an eternity of crude modifications and combat operations and painboy experiments, each day indistinguishable from the last, until time itself loses meaning and there is only the now, the endless experience of suffering that defines every moment. What does this nightmare scenario reveal about the factions involved? For the Emperor's children, it demonstrates the ultimate consequences of their devotion to Slanesh. They pursued sensation so relentlessly that they became slaves to it, unable to exist without constant stimulation, willing to endure any horror rather than face the void of sensory deprivation. The pilot's refusal to activate the self-destruct protocols, even when offered a clean death, shows how completely the addiction has taken hold. For a servant of the Dark Prince, even suffering is preferable to nothingness. For the Orks, the scenario showcases both their greatest strengths and their most horrifying qualities. Their ability to loot and repurpose anything is unmatched in the galaxy. They can take sophisticated technology they do not understand and make it work through a combination of crude modifications and gestalt psychic power. But their complete lack of empathy or understanding regarding the suffering they cause is equally remarkable. Mad Doc Lugnut genuinely does not comprehend that his experiments are torture. He is simply curious, simply exploring, simply doing what painboys do. The cruelty is not intentional malice, but rather the natural result of Ork nature applied to a helpless subject. There is also a dark irony in the way the Orks have accidentally created the perfect punishment for an Emperor's children warrior. By destroying the sonic weaponry and replacing it with crude Ork equivalents, they have stripped away the one source of sensation that made Dreadnought service marginally tolerable. By adding their crude modifications and conducting their experiments, they have flooded the pilot with new experiences, but all of them horrible, all of them violations of body and mind. They have created a situation where the pilot is simultaneously starved for sensation and overwhelmed by it, trapped in a state that would be incomprehensible to any being who had not spent centuries worshipping the god of excess. And perhaps most damning of all, The Orks have demonstrated that they do not need to understand chaos to defeat it. They do not need sophisticated counter-sorcery, or blessed weapons, or purity seals. They simply need to be themselves, to approach everything with the same enthusiastic incomprehension that characterizes their entire civilization. The Emperor's Children pilot expected many possible fates after entombment: capture by the Imperium and execution, falling in battle against a worthy foe, perhaps even eventual ascension to demonhood if service to Slaanesh proved sufficiently devoted. But being looted by Orks, being orcified beyond recognition, becoming purple stompy, this was not a fate that any warrior could have anticipated or prepared for. Conclusion. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But even in a galaxy where entire worlds are burned from orbit and civilizations are ground to dust beneath the treads of continent-sized war machines, even in a universe where gods feast on mortal suffering and the warp itself howls with the screams of the damned, there are still gradations of horror. There are still fates that stand out as particularly terrible, particularly cruel, particularly worthy of the descriptor worse than death. The capture and orcification of an Emperor's Children sonic dreadnought represents one such fate. It is a collision of incompatible philosophies, a meeting of irresistible Ork enthusiasm and immovable Slaaneshi addiction, played out on the body and mind of a warrior who has already sacrificed everything in pursuit of sensation. The pilot sought excess and found deprivation. The pilot sought pleasure and found violation. The pilot sought meaning in experience and found only the endless repetition of crude modifications and combat operations directed by beings who will never understand what they have done. This is not a story with a happy ending. There are no happy endings in Warhammer 40,000. But it is a story that reveals fundamental truths about the factions involved, about the nature of suffering in a universe without mercy, and about what happens when the galaxy's greatest scavengers encounter a prize that should never have been found. Purple Stompy continues to serve in Warboss Skull Crusha's warband, its weapons firing on command, its legs carrying it into battle after battle, its pilot trapped inside, experiencing every moment with the terrible clarity that only a servant of Slaanesh can know. The Orks are pleased with their loot. Mad Doc Lugnut considers the whole affair a successful experiment. And somewhere in the warp, the Dark Prince of Excess observes this situation with whatever passes for amusement among the Chaos Gods, content to let the pilot suffer in this unique and creative way for as long as the body endures. There are no heroes in this story. There are no villains, really, just beings acting according to their nature. The pilot chose to serve Slaanesh and earned the consequences of that choice. The Orks chose to loot everything they find and cannot comprehend why their prize might object to the treatment. And the machine spirit, trapped alongside the pilot in a chassis that has been defiled beyond recognition, can only wait for an ending that may never come. This is Warhammer 40,000. This is what happens when the Orks capture an Emperor's Children dreadnought alive. And this is why, in a galaxy of infinite nightmares, some fates are recognized as worse than others. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most horrifying scenarios the 40k universe has to offer, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of Warhammer lore, bringing you stories that other channels might shy away from. Stories that showcase just how grim and dark the far future really is. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next exploration into the nightmare that is the 41st Millennium. And if you have suggestions for other horrifying scenarios you'd like us to cover, leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.